Hey everyone, today I thought I'd take a little bit of time to go over how I made these nice ruined boundary fence style bases. These are great for things like 40k, as well as really useful for any sort of modern day warfare display or war game you may be playing. We're going to be going over the tools, the equipment, and the techniques of how we made this base today. So let's jump in and see how these glorious bases are made. Starting off, we are going to need a few key items. Firstly, we are naturally going to need a base to work from, and we are also going to need a sheet of cork. And we're going to use this so that we have a nice surface to build the rest of our base from. We can take our cork sheet, rip this down to size, and glue it to the top of our base. While that is drying, we can move across and dig out some of the items that we need for our next steps. These include some metal rods and some metal piping, as well as a metal wire mesh if we're looking to make a fence. There are a large selection of pipes available out there. I'm choosing to go for a slightly thinner gauge aluminium pipe, and the reason for this is because one, aluminium piping is slightly cheaper for me in my local area than something like copper or brass, as well as the fact that it's nice and bendable and malleable, so that if I need to bend anything, tweak anything, or cut through it, it is slightly easier than using a slightly harder metal. Regardless of material or thickness, we can take the chosen rods, measure it against our models that we're going to be using on the base or the display to make sure that the height is suitable. Then we can go in and clip or saw the rod to the correct size. Do bear in mind that if you choose to clip it with clippers as opposed to using a saw, you will have a misshapen end and may need to go in and correct that. With our pipe cut to the correct size, however, we can then use some super glue to mount the pipe into the cork we mounted onto the base. For this base, I wanted to make it look like a damaged fence. So what we can also do is cut a slit into the pipe, mostly going through, allowing us to break this in later steps once we've applied the fencing. This is one of the reasons that I chose to add that layer of cork on top of the base. Not only does that give us a little bit of extra height for our models and give them a bit more impression on the board, it also gives us a nice surface that we can mount our pipes into. In this case, digging a hole and mounting the pipe with super glue, giving it that reinforced hold that we wouldn't get from just mounting it on a plain plastic base. Once our pipe has been sufficiently stuck into our cork, we can then move on to the adding of the fence. And this next step is nice and simple. We want to grab our mesh we're using for a fence and grab a nice pair of scissors and start cutting the mesh to the appropriate size and shape that we want. Then it's just a case of attaching the fence to the fence pole that we have attached to the base. And to do this, we can use super glue, and I personally would recommend using a thicker super glue here, as what you can do is apply the super glue to the fence pole and then apply the fence to the glue. The thicker viscosity of a thick glue will hold that fence in place as the glue dries. Alternatively, if you're like me and you only have thin super glue to hand, it may take a little bit longer, but what we need to do is glue the fence down in sections. Starting with one portion, we can hold it in place until it's dried, and then slowly glue the remaining sections down piece by piece. Just quickly, around this wire mesh that we're using for the fence, this can be slightly sharp and jagged on the edges, so do be careful when handling it, and after the model's been made, when putting it away and people are touching it, it can be slightly sharp and you don't want to cut yourself. But also, potentially more importantly for some people, you can buy this from online, eBay and places, in sheets of A4 wire mesh sold as hobby purpose mesh for dioramas and such like that. And it's quite expensive from the ones that I've seen at least. Whereas you can do what I've done here. And I went out and looked at getting industrial mesh in the form of rat mesh or mouse mesh. And this is designed to go over grates and holes and ventilation parts in your house to stop rodents coming in from the outside. The advantage is it's pretty much the same stuff as we use in the hobby. As long as you check the gauge of the holes that are on the mesh, as well as the actual thickness, for the same price as I could find getting one A4 sheet of this mesh for hobby purposes, I found a 6-meter roll of it for industrial purposes in the sense of building works and putting over your house. So just bear that in mind that you might be able to get this quite cheap if you're not looking for hobby mesh and you're just buying standard mesh. With that tangent over, we can move over to an optional step, which is barbed wire. Naturally, if you're not going to use barbed wire, you can skip this. but I do like to use it because it means in an army project I can have some with barbed wire, some without, and it makes it nice cohesive if I'm not putting a fence pole in every single base. If we are using barbed wire, we do have a quick option for this, which is to take some wire and then wrap it around a pipe the same as the one we are using for our base. This will give us that typical rings of barbed wire look, and then we can take a little bit of super glue and mount this to the top of our fence. Once it is firmly mounted and secured in place, we can come in with some clippers and snip the ends to the appropriate size. This barbed wire is another one of those products that you can buy for the hobby, and it is generally quite expensive. And I found something that I quite like as an alternative. Obviously you've got the typical guitar strings that you may have seen, but those are quite elastic and they tend to return back to the same shape that they were before. So unless you're going to glue them into a ring, it can be quite difficult to use guitar strings, even though they have that nice texture, which on a smaller scale may look like barbed wire. So as an alternative to that, we're going to be using Canthal, which is the wires that they sell for vaping and electronic cigarettes. They make coils out of this. You can see where I'm going with it. A vapor can make a coil out of this to heat up their e-liquid, and they come in an incredible amount of variations. You've got ones that are single wires, you've got twisted wires, you've got things that look a lot like barbed wire, and you can take all of those and essentially use them in your hobby products and projects entirely. So we're taking some twisted wire here that is used for vaping, and instead we're going to turn it into barbed wire for our fence. Once the barbed wire is glued in place and secure, we can go around and apply some texture paste or sand to the remaining cork areas to build out a little bit of texture. Then we can go around and make any final amendments and arrangements to the shaping of the wire mesh or the fence. Doing this either through some last moment cutting with a pair of scissors or bending the whole form such as we are doing here. Where we previously cut the fence, we're going to be breaking this over and reshaping the metal fence to give it that look of a fence that has been crushed and pulled down so that someone can get by. The reason we apply the texture paste before we go in and finish the shaping on the fence is because it can be a lot easier to get to all of the areas that are on the floor without having the fence in the way that we need to then contend with. So once the texture paste is down and, well, it doesn't have to be dry, but is down and sorted, we can then bend everything into shape, and we don't have to worry about the fence being in the way of us basing the rest of the base. But once we have got that down, it's then a case of painting, and obviously you can paint this in any scheme. We're going for a deserty one here, and we want it to be nice, bright and vibrant, so we're starting with a zenithal undercoat. For the paint job itself, in order to gain this sandy looking base that's quite bright, we're going to be starting off with a base coat of an appropriate colour called dark sand. We can then grab a little bit of light flesh once this sand is dry and use this light flesh to overbrush the entire base, which will help to pick out all of the raised textures that we put in from our texture paste. Once this is dry, we can then go around and give the base a nice coat of Agrax Earthshade. This will help to act as pooled mud in the recesses and textures of our base, adding a little bit of detail without a lot of work. Naturally, as I said, the actual earth tones that you're using, you could paint however you want. You could do it as an astro granite instead of a wilderness, or you could do it as a green base rather than a desert base. That bit's entirely up to you, but that does leave us with one bit, which is the fence. And we're going to be doing that last. And the reason for that is because it has a lot of metallics, in the sense of it's all metallics. And we don't want to be getting metallic flakes everywhere else, so I just leave them till last to make it a little bit easier. And the first step we're going to want to do is base coat the metals back to a darker colour, mainly black. In order to do that, we're going to be applying a base coat of Black Legion, which is a contrast, making it nice and easy to flow into all of the areas without a lot of gloopy texture. Having this as a black base coat again will help to give maximum shine from the metallics when we come on to our next steps, which is to grab either a dark bronze or a brown tin metal sort of colour and apply this as a thick coat over all of the areas that we've painted black. We do want to try and catch all of the recesses here as well, but if there is a little bit of black left in the details that we can't quite reach, that isn't actually an issue. We can then use our final metallic, and this is in the form of a light silver. And we can use this to overbrush all of the metallic areas that we've painted so far. And this should give us a nice metallic look, ranging from a dirty, rusty brown to a lighter silver. As always, when working with metals, we do want to try and let them dry completely. And the reason for that is we're going to be looking to apply a wash shortly. And what we don't want is this wash to pick up all of the metal flecks from the paint jobs that we've done so far, and then deposit them in areas we don't want them around the model, potentially even on the sandy base that shouldn't be metallic. So, waiting for the metals to fully dry, we can then grab our wash and go to town. And as you expect, this one is a nice and simple process. It's just a case of applying our chosen wash all over the metals. However, we do want to make sure to catch any of the pooling around the bottom of the fence or the poles. This is where the fence would meet the sand. We just want to mop up any pooling there. Equally, once we've applied it across all of the fence, depending on the type of panel and diameter of holes you've got, we may need to go around and pop some of the wash bubbles that have appeared in between the holes of the fence. Once the wash is applied and the wash has dried, the base is mostly there. Obviously, we've got a few tweaks and things that we can do, besides just if you wanted painting it an entirely different colour. First, we can apply some grass tufts and things like that, as well as potentially, if you wanted, some signage on the actual fence. Things that say things like, "Caution, do not enter, Xenos are here," things like that. You can go through and add all of that on and give your bases a little bit extra flair. Also, one thing that I did want to highlight right at the end when most of you have left, so those of you who are here are the only ones that are going to see this real secret, and that is, this works really well for flying bases, believe it or not. And what we've done here, for example, is made a standard fence base similar to the one that I've just shown you now, except the pipe has been extended out of the top, and we've also put a slightly higher diameter rod in the bottom of the flyer. This means that we can essentially pop the rods within themselves, and we have a really nice detachable model from its base, meaning that this flyer can be packed away very, very conveniently for travel to and from games. And then when we put it on the tabletop, it just looks awesome, doesn't it? Anyway, if you want to see more bases like this that are really practical, fun to make, and make your armies look a lot more impressive on the tabletop, why not check out this playlist here? Otherwise, remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.